I am sure that you have heard the saying that what goes around comes around. Or to put it differently, you reap what you sow. And that's a truism that seems to work out time and time again in everyday life. It's not only true for individuals, it works for kingdoms and groups of people as well. We're going to see in this next period of the divided kingdom that both Israel and Judah reaped what they sowed for years, even over a couple of centuries. Both of these kingdoms of Israel and Judah had been sowing unfaithfulness to the covenant, cruelty to their fellow man. They'd been worshiping idols, sacrificing their own children even. They'd been living for themselves and copying the wicked ways of the people around them. In the previous lesson, we looked at the establishment of the United Kingdom of Israel ruled by Saul, David, and Solomon, at first under the direction of Samuel. Now let's move on to the period of the divided kingdoms, which lasted for a little over 200 years, from about 930 to about 722 or 721 BC. Parts of the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, as well as the prophetic books of Isaiah, Hosea, Joel, Obadiah, Micah, Amos, and Jonah were written during this time. And during this period, United Israel lost its impressive empire, partly due to Solomon's heavy demands for resources for his extensive building projects. It was also partly because of the long-standing issues between the northern tribal group, led by Ephraim, and the southern tribal group led by Judah. The main break came when Solomon's son Rehoboam arrogantly disregarded the needs of his overburdened people. The tribes had petitioned Rehoboam to ease Solomon's heavy taxes and conscription of the people for work projects. But rather than considering their distress as his older advisors counseled, Rehoboam listened to the younger hotheads who advised taking a hard line by threatening the people with even more burdens if they complained. His famous reply in 1 Kings 12 is the height of tyranny. "My little finger is thicker than my father's waist," he said. "My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." Rehoboam's foolishness sparked a revolt as the northern tribes broke away to form a separate kingdom. This northern kingdom kept the name Israel, although Scripture sometimes refers to it by the name of its leading tribe, Ephraim. The new capital of Israel was located at the city of Samaria. What was left of David's kingdom in the south continued under David's descendants and was now known as Judah, from the name of the leading tribe. Judah's territory included the lands of the tribes of Judah, Benjamin, and Simeon, as well as the cities of their allotted Levites. Its capital continued at Jerusalem. This map shows not only the territory of Israel and Judah, but also how the land once under Solomon's control had shrunk. Remember that under Solomon, United Israel controlled all the original tribal lands, as well as the subdued and allied nations from the Euphrates River in the northeast to Egypt and the Gulf of Aqaba in the south. Solomon's United Israel dominated the kingdoms of Moab, Edom, and Ammon. It also had diplomatic ties with the cities of Tyre and Sidon and others further north along the coast, as well as Egypt in the south. Now let's look at each of these kingdoms in a bit more detail. The kingdom of Israel had a very unstable political history. In its 200-year existence, Israel was ruled by no less than 19 individual kings from 9 successive dynasties, or lines of kings. That's an average of about 10 years apiece. There were a number of violent overthrows and palace coups. Jeroboam was an official in King Solomon's government, and it was Jeroboam who led the initial revolt against Solomon's son Rehoboam and set the tone of unfaithfulness toward God and idol worship. One of his first acts as king of the Northern Confederation was to set up 2 rival worship centers at the city of Dan in the north and at Bethel near the border with Judah. Their purpose was to move people away from the true God and the connection that his temple would give them at Jerusalem. The main deities that Jeroboam set up in these new centers were Baal, Asherah, and Moloch. Like their neighbor nations around them and the Canaanites before them, Israel fell into worshiping Baal and these other deities. They believed that worshiping these demonic gods would ensure abundant crops and large herds of livestock. Their religious rites featured sensuality and demonic child sacrifice. Besides the main centers at Dan and Bethel, smaller centers of Baal worship also dotted the land. These rival worship centers were intended to prevent people from going to Jerusalem to worship, where the kings of Judah ruled. As a result, worship of the true God became much more difficult for the people of Israel. Asher was the goddess of fertility, known in other lands under names such as Venus, Aphrodite, or Freya. She was worshipped in temples called Asherim, where so-called rites of worship were conducted with ritual prostitutes. She was also worshipped under trees and in forests where local women were expected to fulfill the ritual function from time to time. You can imagine the impact that this pagan worship had on national morals and family life. Moloch was the demonic deity whose idol contained a furnace. Infants and small children were offered to Moloch to ensure prosperity and protection by throwing them into the burning belly of the idol. Predictably, the result of this demonic worship was widespread cruelty and injustice in society. Amos 2, verses 6 through 8 say, "For 3 sins of Israel, even for 4, I will not relent. They sell the innocent for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They trample on the heads of the poor as on the dust of the ground and deny justice to the oppressed. Father and son use the same girl and so profane my holy name. They lie down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge. In the house of their God they drink wine taken as fines." No wonder Jeremiah issued such a harsh rebuke in chapter 32 of his book. He delivered God's message like this: "My people have set up their abominable idols right in my own temple, defiling it. They have built pagan shrines to Baal in the valley of Ben Hinnom, and there they sacrifice their sons and daughters to Moloch. I have never commanded such a horrible deed. It never even crossed my mind to command such a thing." Clearly, Israel had sunk very low since Joshua led them into the Promised Land as a people living under God's righteous covenant. The record of Israel is chaotic and sad, with each new king seeming worse than the one before. For instance, there was King Omri, who during his reign severely weakened the growing Assyrian Empire to the east while expanding Israel's influence. The Assyrians were so intimidated by him that they called Israel simply the house of Omri. Then there was his infamous son Ahab, who married the wicked Canaanite princess Jezebel from the city of Sidon. This evil couple cheated and extorted the people of Israel and mocked God, opposing him in every way possible. Jezebel enticed and threatened the people into even deeper Baal worship. So it was the prophet Elijah whom God sent to deal with Ahab and Jezebel. 1 Kings 16:30-33 says, "Ahab son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord above all before him. As if it had been a light thing for Ahab to walk in the sins of Jeroboam son of Nebat, he took for a wife Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and served Baal and worshipped him." Ahab was not a good man to begin with, and he was weak. So under the influence of his wife, Jezebel, he came to do very evil things, including stealing land from a righteous man named Naboth, just so he could possess his excellent vineyard. Now, Elijah was not a Judean. He probably came from that half of the tribe of Manasseh living east of the Jordan River in what is today the Golan Heights. He ministered to the kingdom of Israel and spoke out specifically against all of the wickedness of Ahab and Jezebel. Because of his opposition, Jezebel incited her husband to declare Elijah an outlaw, someone to be hunted down on sight. So Elijah had to go into hiding in the wilderness. And you may remember the story of how Elijah was fed by ravens and drank from a spring deep in the canyon of his hideout. Because of his opposition to them, Elijah lived for 3.5 years in hiding until God called him to bring down their evil rule. He did so in a public contest with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. In this contest, God exposed the prophets of Baal as frauds by sending down fire from heaven to burn up a sacrifice when their rituals failed to do so. So God was shown to be the true God. But even so, Israel as a nation never repented in any real meaningful way. There were several other kings of Israel that we should note, like Jehu, Baasha, Shallum, and Pekah. All of them were unfaithful to the covenant to one degree or another. Besides Elijah, prophets like Elisha, Jonah, and Amos spoke to the northern kingdom about its wickedness, idolatry, and cruelty. But for the most part, Few paid much attention. Instead, Israel continued to experience revolts and overthrows of government on a regular basis. As Israel declined in power after the disastrous 3.5-year famine during the time of Ahab, they came under the oppression of neighbors to the north, like Damascus, and they suffered severe raids by the Assyrians. They even made war against their sister tribes in the kingdom of Judah. Also, during these years of decline, the kingdom of Assyria was growing and gaining strength. They had been soundly defeated by Israel under King Solomon and again by Omri. Since then, the Assyrians had been biding their time. God had even had mercy during its years of defeat. They had experienced a brief turning to faith in Israel's God under the prophet Jonah around 780 BC. But that revival didn't last more than a generation. From the beginning of the divided kingdoms in the 900s BC, there was periodic war between Israel and Judah, as well as internal divisions within the kingdom of Israel. These conflicts weakened both kingdoms, which was just the opportunity that the Assyrians were waiting for. In the early 700s, they began raiding Israel for wealth and slaves. The raids and deportations of Israelites increased in the 740s as Israel proved itself too weakened to do much to stop them. To the south, the kingdom of Judah enjoyed a much more stable society. Godly kings like Jehoshaphat, Joash, Uzziah, and Hezekiah, as well as Josiah, continued to lead Judah in keeping God's covenant. An Assyrian invasion of Israel that spilled over into Judah occurred during the time of King Hezekiah. Many Judean towns were captured and their people taken captive to Assyria. Only Hezekiah's humility and the strong faith of the prophet Isaiah spared Jerusalem from the same fate. Other Judean kings like Ahaziah, Manasseh, and Ammon lapsed into the same idolatry and wickedness of their kinsmen to the north. Queen Athaliah was especially wicked. She usurped the throne of Judah by murdering her male family members. Then in the late 800s BC, the boy king Joash led a revival of faith when he overthrew his wicked grandmother Athaliah. Likewise, in the late 600s BC, Josiah led a brief return to the covenant after the deeply evil reigns of his grandfather Manasseh and his father Ammon. But these revivals weren't permanent either. The Judeans were a bit more faithful to the covenant, at least when their kings were godly. But the unfaithfulness of Judah was spreading as well. So God also sent prophets to the Judeans. Brave men like Joel, Isaiah, Micah, Habakkuk, and Jeremiah urged Judah to remain faithful. The Judeans often ignored and persecuted those God had sent to warn them. During this time, talk of a deliverer became prominent in the ministry of the prophets. Now, the concept that God would send a deliverer had been mentioned in Scripture before, but only rarely. The deliverer was called Messiah, God's anointed one. Of all the prophets, Isaiah spoke the most about the Messiah during his long ministry. Some of the clearest and most memorable references to the coming Messiah are in Isaiah chapters 9, 40, 42, 52, and 53. Here are some examples. Isaiah 42, 1 through 4 proclaims, "Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged till he establishes justice on earth. In his teaching, the islands will put their hope." In other words, the Messiah won't come with pomp and ceremony, but will arise from more obscure circumstances. Isaiah 52, 13 through 15 says, "See, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted." Just as there were many who were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness, so he will sprinkle many nations. Isaiah 53, 2 through 6 describes the Messiah as the suffering servant. He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Messianic passages are also contained in Micah 5, Habakkuk 1, Jeremiah 23 and 25, and Zechariah 11 through 13, as well as scattered throughout the Psalms and later in the prophet Daniel. Well, let's move on to the next period, which is Judah alone. The period begins with God's long-postponed judgment against Israel. Beginning in the 740s, the kingdom of Assyria rose to power and established its dominance over surrounding nations. Israel sometimes cooperated with the Assyrians, sometimes they defied them when they demanded submission and financial tribute. In 722 BC, the Assyrians besieged Samaria, and the following year they conquered Israel and its capital, taking the survivors far to the north. So what happened to those dispersed tribes of Israel? Reuben, Gad, Manasseh, Ephraim, Dan, Naphtali, Issachar, Zebulun, and Asher. According to 2 Chronicles 15:9, significant numbers from the northern kingdom migrated south out of Israel into Judah. These were the people who seemed to refuse to participate in Baal worship and the other dark practices instituted by Jeroboam in the late 900s BC and continued by later kings. It records that King Asa of Judah, great-grandson of Solomon, assembled all Judah and Benjamin and the people from Ephraim, Manasseh, and Simeon who had settled among them, for large numbers had come over to him from Israel when they saw that the Lord his God was with him. In the decades that followed, others may have sailed away to the new city of Carthage in North Africa. Still others may have migrated north into modern Turkey and even beyond into what is now southern Russia. The reasons why many Israelites may have abandoned the Promised Land were varied. Besides a desire on the part of those who wanted to worship the true God and join Judah, there were those who saw new opportunities in the new and growing city of Carthage on the coast of modern Tunisia in North Africa. Many also migrated north during those terrible years of famine under the wicked King Ahab in the middle of the 800s BC. Beginning in the 760s BC and going all the way through 721 BC, the expanding kingdom of Assyria made 3 campaigns against Israel. In each of these campaigns, they captured and deported large groups of people. The final deportation in 721 BC was when they rounded up what was left of the Israelites. At that time, almost all the remaining population were taken captive and removed out of the land. It's interesting, though, that in Assyrian archives, they record that after the fall of Israel's capital, Samaria, the Assyrian army took away only 27,000 people. Now, that might seem like a lot, but only a century before, the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom could muster as many as 1 million fighting men if necessary. A mere 27,000 captives at the end of Israel's kingdom surely means that much of its original population had already died or moved on. Where did they go? 2 Kings 17:6 records that in the 9th year of Israelite King Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he carried the Israelites away to Assyria and placed them in Hala and on the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. So they were dropped off in what is now the northern part of Iraq and the southern part of Turkey, and others were settled further east in northern Persia in a region then known as Media on the shores of the Caspian Sea. That region is in the modern country of Iran. What about those who had migrated earlier, before the last captivity? They may have been scattered over much of the settled world at the time. Some of them went south, deep into Africa. Others went west along the coast of North Africa and southern Europe. Some went north into Asia Minor and southern Russia, and others east into Central Asia. However, most scholars claim that no one really knows what happened to the northern tribes of Israel. They presume that the Israelites displaced by the Assyrians just stayed where they'd been dropped off, mixed with the people there, and were lost to history. And that may be true. But lately I've been leaning toward a different theory. Now, I don't know for sure, but based upon quite a bit of evidence buried in ancient histories and forgotten accounts, I don't think these people stayed put at all. Now think about it. Why would they? Instead, a few decades after they arrived in these places, many of them could have escaped out of the Assyrian Empire entirely, especially when Assyria was threatened by its eastern neighbor Babylon. And of course, Babylon had also been subject to Assyria, and in 626 BC they rebelled and brought their oppressors down. While Assyria and Babylon were focused on one another, some Israelites may have escaped north through eastern Turkey and through the mountains into the wilds of southern Russia, joining their kinsmen who may have gone there earlier. Some moved further east into Central Asia, while others moved west through Turkey and into southern Europe. Others remained in the area for several centuries. Some accounts seem to show that centuries later, these displaced and exiled Israelites eventually came to dominate the region, and they formed their own empire known as Parthia. Interestingly enough, the Persians used the term Parthian to describe someone exiled. And of course, the Israelites were an exiled people. So over many centuries, groups of displaced Israelites could have ended up in places as far apart as India and Western Europe. Remember, it's a theory, but if it's true, that means that many people today are descended from these Israelite refugees. In fact, one of the main escape routes that these Israelite refugees from Assyria would have taken was through the Caucasus Mountains that separate the Middle East from southern Russia. Now let's think. Why are the peoples of Europe generally labeled as Caucasians? That's because most historians agree that the ancestors of the Europeans came from somewhere in the region of the Caucasus Mountains. And isn't it interesting that about that same time, elements of Israelites were dispersed out of the Middle East in the late 700s and early 600s BC. That's the same time that the ancestors of the Europeans emerged from the Caucasus Mountain region and later migrated west and north into Europe. Something to think about. Now, don't misunderstand. Unlike some others who believe in this theory, I don't think that the Europeans are pure Israelites. But I do think that it's likely that European people are a mix of Israelites and people that were already living in the lands that they passed through. There's also evidence that some of the Israelite people went from Central Asia east into Afghanistan and northern India, and even beyond. Other records hint that some may have escaped south and migrated into Africa as well. So when God said that he was going to make Abraham the father of many nations, he certainly wasn't kidding. When Israel fell, other Israelites survived the conquest and fled south into Judah. Over the years, they merged with the Judeans. So from this point on, when we talk about the remnant of Israel who survived in the kingdom of Judah, we're just going to use the blanket term Judean or Jew for anyone living in the kingdom, regardless of tribal heritage. Other survivors from the northern kingdom managed to hide out. They mixed with conquered peoples from distant lands that the Assyrians deported and settled around the city of Samaria. This mixture of Israelite survivors from Samaria and other conquered peoples there became known as Samaritans. You'll recall that the little kingdom of Judah was also threatened by Assyria. However, they miraculously survived the Assyrian destruction. 2 Kings chapter 19 records how the angel of the Lord destroyed the Assyrian army in one night as it besieged Jerusalem. After that miraculous deliverance, Judah struggled along by itself for a bit over 100 years, from 721 to 606 BC. But Judah didn't learn. The lesson that God will judge his people when they forsake him and give themselves over to wickedness should have been plain and unmistakable. Yet the Judeans mostly missed it. The Judean kings Manasseh and Amon ruled during this time, and they were the worst of Judah's kings as they scorned and suppressed God's ways. They engaged in gross idolatry and perversion for decades, and they paid a heavy price for their sin. However, wicked King Amon's son Josiah did bring a revival of faithfulness to the covenant, which bought Judah some time. Unfortunately, Josiah died young, tragically killed in battle as recorded in 2 Kings chapter 23. The revival of faithfulness was short-lived then, and after that Judah lapsed again into the darkness of idolatry and disobedience. Then, beginning in 606 BC, God sent the newly triumphant Babylonians to bring judgment on Judah. Babylon had conquered and taken over the Assyrian Empire some 20 years before. Between 606 and 587 BC, the Babylonians deported 3 waves of Judeans out of their land and settled them in colonies in Babylon. Judean cities were destroyed and burned. Solomon's temple in Jerusalem was taken apart stone by stone, and its golden implements were carried away by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. This event ushered in the period of the Babylonian exile. Psalm 137 describes the deep grief of the exiled Judeans. It says, "By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion." Zion is Jerusalem. "There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked of us songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, 'Sing us one of the songs of Zion.' But how can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land?" The exiled Jews remained in Babylon and surrounding lands for 70 years, just as the prophet Jeremiah predicted. Speaking of Judah in chapter 25 of this prophecy, he said, "This whole country will become a desolate wasteland, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. But when the 70 years are fulfilled, I will punish the king of Babylon and his nation, the land of the Babylonians, for their guilt, declares the Lord, and I will make it desolate forever." It was only after 70 years of captivity did a relatively small number of Judeans return to the land and rebuild. The rest remained in a dispersion that lasts down to this very day. So in telling the story of this era, I have referred to the books of Samuel and Kings. The books of Chronicles tell much the same story from the unique perspective of the Judean kingdom and with a special priestly interpretation of the events. Samuel and Kings recount the same chain of events as the book of Chronicles, but they do so from the point of view of Israel as a whole. All right, that's enough for this lesson. I'll see you in lesson 7, where we will take a look at the period of the exile. See you then.